Again, welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. The theme this evening is continuing on the last two sessions that we've done on long jump. In the first session, we looked at an overview of the event. The second session, we looked at the runway, which primarily looked at the generation of horizontal velocity in the event. But tonight we're going to be looking at primarily the penultimate and the takeoff. And the key role in those events is to generate the vertical velocity and vertical lift. And we'll go into that in a lot more detail shortly. So without further ado, we'll crack on. Frank, happy to go?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Cool. Okay, so the aim of long jump, and we've covered this before, is to attain a maximum horizontal distance from the front of the takeoff board. And as I mentioned before, the horizontal component of speed is one of the critical functions, but you don't have any vertical lift, you're not going to get a distance, and that's going to affect the parabolic curve. So yes, again, we're looking at kind of revisiting this deterministic model for the long jump. All of these components have a contributing factor to the total distance jumped in the athlete. And this evening, again, we're going to be looking at these components. Body position at takeoff, height or center of mass is key. We're looking at the resultant velocity, not just the horizontal, but looking at how we determine the resultant velocity with the vertical component. And of course, that's going to have an impact on the angle of takeoff on that as well. So flight distance, the speed and projection angle of the center of mass at takeoff are dependent on the interaction between the horizontal and vertical velocities at touchdown and that through the takeoff. As we can see, it's indicated by that blue line is the resultant velocity. And as horizontal velocity is developed sufficiently in the approach, the production of vertical velocity in the takeoff phase has to be regarded as an important aspect of these jumps. It's going to determine the distance. Okay. Penultimate stride. So what we looked at in terms of presenting this phase of the jump, we want to look at the penultimate stride, the role and the purpose of that penultimate stride, and then we'll do that with the takeoff. Again, we'll look at answering any questions that you have at the end of the penultimate phase before we move on. So the penultimate stride, as we can see here, it's that second last step is denoted there by the red dots. The purpose of it is a lowering of the center of mass, and the lowering of that center of mass, the degree of which and the lowering of which will change by the athlete's ability. So very much a development athlete may have very little lowering, whereas we will see shortly with Brittany Reese, she's probably one of the biggest kind of components of lowering of center of mass through that penultimate phase. But the penultimate is essentially the second last step into the approach. But the goals of the penultimate, we want to maintain that horizontal velocity. We don't want to lose the speed that we've generated up until that point. We need to make sure we maintain the postures and positions that we've established coming in as well, and maintain those ranges of motion that we saw coming in those strides. So these are the key things with the purpose and the goals of the penultimate. Yeah. In terms of the technical considerations for the penultimate step, first of all, and I think Frank, you mentioned this the other day in a conversation that we had, everything comes from the foot contact up. If you don't get the foot contact right, then everything else doesn't fit properly, doesn't follow suit. So first and foremost, we need to get the foot contact right. So we're looking for an active flat foot contact, and that touchdown, we want to see the shin at 90 degrees, nominally 90 degrees, so perpendicular. But then as the athlete moves forward through that penultimate phase, we see that rotation of the shin and the shin rotating closer to the ground. Again, we want to see, along with the active foot contact, we want to see that ankle dorsiflex position. So we don't want to see the toe dropping coming in. We want to see that toe switched on and that dorsiflex position. And in terms of the foot contact in relation to the center of mass in the body, as we can see here on illustrated on the top image by Brittany Reese here, the foot contact is just slightly in front of the center of mass. The lowering of the body center of mass, we want to see a forward, it's a continued that forward rotation or forward movement, but then we see a downward position as the center of mass lowers. Again, we want to see a braced and upright trunk position throughout. And again, conceptually, the lowest position through the penultimate and into the takeoff is directly over the board. However, certainly from my perspective, I want to see if we're looking at the path of the center of mass coming into the takeoff, ideally, I want to see the center of mass rising as we come off the penultimate, off the board. So we see the vertical velocity with a positive value rather than lowering onto the board and we've got this negative value. So hopefully that makes sense. The flat foot for beginners, again, when we're coaching this, from a development point of view or coaching the penultimate, when the athlete's coming up, they're sprinting on the balls of their feet, so they've got this elevated position. So when they actually strike the flat foot, that is enough to lower the center of mass. And for me personally, it's not something, I don't coach a lowering or an active lowering. I think it's something that happens naturally with the athlete coming into the board as they load up in preparation for takeoff. And for me, I very much just looking at just that, pulling that foot, active foot down, just in front of the center of mass, but in that flat foot. And for me, that is enough to give me the displacement of the hips that I'm looking for. Frank, is there anything you want to add to there? Was that?
Yeah, I think you said basically what I was going to say, but my understanding is that the penultimate stroke loading the center of mass is not something which needs to be learned or taught. Just to explain further, if you were to get, a 6-7-year-old child and ask them to run down the runway and jump into the sandpit, they will definitely demonstrate the penultimate step prior to the takeoff. So that, to me, happens naturally. What you don't want to teach is people to lower themselves any lower than, I'm looking at Brittany and I think she is very, very strong to get away with that. And not many people actually get in that position. But the lowering there is a bit too low for me.
I think that's a good point. And I think it's important when we're looking at athletes like this as technical models and looking at trying to emulate and copy them. We need to be mindful that that is unique to Brittany and her strength levels support her to do that. But then what we see in the last stride shortly is her last stride is phenomenally short, compared to the penultimate. So there's almost like a 20% difference in stride length from the penultimate to the last stride. The thing that for me, just to kind of before we move on to the displacement bit, is the rhythm of the penultimate. And again, it's not kind of mentioned here, but we're looking at that kind of da 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 kind of rhythm. So those last two strides, that last two foot contacts are much faster than the previous. So, and that reflects that shortening of that last stride following the penultimate. And then the last thing really for technical considerations in the penultimate is looking at the displacement between the last step here, and this is illustrated by Daria Klashina here. And what I'm looking for a displacement is the distance between the two legs. But what that's actually achieving is we're actually getting a pre-stretch of the hip flexors. So we've got hip extension on that left leg there, as we can see in the picture. What that does is that preloads the hip flexors, so we get a stretch reflex. So as we get a stretch and loading on that back leg, the reflex action will enable that drive leg to come through quicker for the takeoff. Hope that's clear. And we'll have some videos to show evidence of some of that stuff on that. So what we have here is some support and biomechanical data to reinforce some of these points. So if you look at Brittany Reese here, if you're looking at the blue is the third last stride, the red is the penultimate, the second last, and then the grey is last. And you can see there's a general theme of a short, long, short, in all of these finalists. And we can see here with Brittany a 206, then 230 on the long, and then 187 in the last stride. And we can see here on the second last ratio, the second last to the last, we can see it's minus 19%. So it's 19% shorter than the penultimate. The next one, Daria, 10%, Tiana Bartoletta, 9% shorter. So the general theme is we've got this short, long, short to set up the hip position. So as the penultimate length is longer, the hips drop, and that's that lowering, and then we rise coming onto the takeoff. That's ideally what we want to see. Where we actually see on the right, on the top right hand table here, the lowering at center of mass. Now this is the lowering of the center of mass at takeoff, and because Brittany is gone from a low position from the penultimate into a relatively short last stride, her hip position is actually going up the way coming into takeoff. The lowering will happen as a result of the knee flexing at takeoff, as we naturally see, and we'll go into that shortly as well. Anything you want to pick out on that?
Yeah, I was going to say you can actually see from the data, and you're not entirely correct, Darren. 95% of most of the jumpers have gone through the short, long, short on their last 3 strides before takeoff. However, if you look at Chantel, if you look at Chantel, she does go long, short, long. And there's always one who would defy the rules, and that's what she's done. Yeah,
I stand corrected. Thank you. Cool. All right. And then the men, again, very similar in the men, although, yeah, I think in the men this time, all of them have actually got short, long, short, and where again, Manyonga, he's a 19% ratio, 10% for Lawson. Samai's probably the one that's most even, and we'll look at a video of him jumping later on, but 216, 218, 215, that's near as flat coming in, isn't it, really, on that. But we can see on Manyonga the lowering at center of mass at takeoff, 5 centimeters, which is significant on that. Okay.
Can you just flip back to the women's for a moment? So, I mean, if you look at the women's data on the right hand side, you can see, you can read a lot obviously into the data, and you compare Blessing Okapara, and you look at horizontal velocity, which is 8.98 meters per second, far greater than Klashina's 8.27. That you would expect Blessing to be jumping a lot further, and they're both about the same height, 1.80 meters. But there is a big difference which we all need to take into consideration as a coach. The body mass is what causes the problem. So when you look at Klashina, I think it's got a body mass somewhere
57 kilos.
Yeah, 57
or there or thereabouts.
Yeah. So you're looking at Blessing, who's carrying 68 kilos. So she's given away 10 kilos of body mass. So that will make a lot of difference. And as coaches, that's what we should also be looking for. Yeah.
And the other thing for me is that looking at Reese and Klashina versus Bartoletta, the height difference as well.
Yeah.
So Daria is 180 centimeters tall, and yet she's got a stride length of less than 2. Brittany's 173, 174, and yet her last stride is 187.
Yeah.
And yet Tiana is 168. So the shortest of the lot, she's got the longest stride length. So again, it's looking at this data in relation to the athlete and the individual athlete, and I think that's really important.
Yeah.
And again, for the men, I've got some stats of the men. Again, Manyonga's 189 in height. which is what, 6'3", just short of 6'3", 6'2", 6'3",
Yeah.
weighing in at 82 kilos. Lawson 188, height about 78 kilos, and so my 185 at 75 kilos. So just interesting to see where these guys sit in terms of the height and their weight on that.
And again, there's always one that defies the rules. Short, long, short, and Lapierre goes long, short, long. If you look at the data, yeah.
So Fabrice there 240, 237, and then 216.
Mm.
But I think in some places, you know, in some competitions with Fabrice, Frank, you're right. You know, I think he's a huge last stride to generate huge vertical lift.
Yeah.
So we'll see Lapierre there 3.8. I mean, he's almost, you know, there are better ones there, but I think in other competitions you could see him probably getting over 4 meters per second in terms of vertical velocity. But yeah, okay, cool. So in terms of the penultimate takeoff, the takeoff preparation of the topic was generally characterized, and I think this has kind of been fairly well researched by a number of these authors, and again, further data from Berlin, and it's a little bit older, but we talk about the horizontal velocity and what they found in generally in the research, that the decreased length in the last stride has a direct impact in the velocity and then in reducing the velocity of the approach coming in. And this is evidenced through this graph from 2009, where if you look at Dwight Phillips, he's 230, 262, and then 2 meters on the last, and his horizontal velocity is 1108, 1112, and then 1078. So there is a kind of bit of a correlation where you're shortening that last stride to set the hips up for takeoff. It does have an impact on the velocity on that. Cool. So let's have a look at some videos that I've pulled together for this evening. The first one, and this is really going to focus on the penultimate. I've got three. I've got this. This is Brittany winning the World Championships in 2017. I've got the same clip 3 times, and we just see it at full speed, 25%, and then 10% slow motion, so we can get to see what's actually happening. Okay, maybe through this, show that one more time. And we can see that lowering happening.
Yeah.
So we can see here she's mid-stride and coming into the penultimate on the touchdown. Let's see if I can pause it better. See if I can move this, guys. So we can see here how, and again, it's a similar image to what we saw earlier in the presentation, where we can see that that deep flexing of the ankle, the knee, and the hips as she's coming into the penultimate. Again, this is excessive. And then as she rolls over, we can extend, and she's got that short last stride, which means that the direction of her hips are actually traveling in an upward direction. And we talk about there's a little bit of lowering that we saw in that table of 1 centimeter, but that's as a result of the knee flexion that occurs at takeoff. And then from there. I've got some comments that saying that someone can't see the video clips. So can anybody else see them or not see them? It'd be great to get a quick reply on that. Yeah, all good, all good. Okay, so that individual we need to look at is. And Daria Klashina was another one that we looked at in terms of the stats. Different position, different athlete, different running style, much more upright in terms of our posture. We see a little bit of lowering, but not as much as Brittany Reese. Let's have a look at that one more time.
And you could see how she quickens the last 2-3 strides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can see that in the rhythm. Okay, cool. Okay, now, and then last one on this one. Conscious of time, where we are. We've got Tiana Bartlett, which is the rhythm-wise much faster, much quicker turnover. And we can see a much more, even less pronounced last stride as we've seen with the others. Okay, I think we will crack on. So takeoff. So I think for me at this point, did you have any questions in relation to the penultimate? We've got here, since you do not intentionally teach the lowering, are you more focused on teaching the 2 quick steps? Let's go for that question. Frank, I'm going to pass that to you quickly first.
Yeah, I think focus more on the last 2 strides, and that's how I would teach my athletes rather than lowering, because you start teaching them lowering, then you're going to lose a bit of speed, going to lose a bit of velocity on the runway. So I would say just quickening on that last 2 strides. They're really important. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, as I mentioned before, I typically look at the flat foot contact and make sure we've got a stiff knee. So we don't want to see that knee collapsing in the penultimate as it touches down, because then that's just going to lower even more. But I like going that long short. So for me, that long short in the last 2 really sets the direction of the hips up. And it means that the athlete is essentially lighter at takeoff because they're already traveling in a positive direction. Whereas if they're traveling down and loading onto the board, then they're essentially heavier because you've got that direction of gravity and stuff on top of them. So, so that for me, the last 2 is very much the flat, and then that shorter takeoff.
Yeah. So just to add, the last 3 strides are also quicker than the preceding ones. The increase in rhythm occurs because the last stride, the takeoff is generally shorter than the penultimate stride. Yeah.
Okay, Carl. I understand the concept, but how do you convey or coach to the athlete what is necessary? Some have too much lowering, or some have none, much like your 2 slide models. Any cues to establish patterns going from the 3rd last step to the penultimate and then the takeoff plan? Frank, do you want to go with that one first?
There are several ways you could do this. You could speak to the athlete and ask the athlete to make the last 3 strides or steps quicker than the previous steps. The athlete can think of penultimate stride as being shorter than the previous stride. They will therefore not lunge into the board. The athlete simply puts an active flat foot to the floor on the penultimate step. Yeah, you could try that. That action alone causes the center of mass to be lower than the previous step without it being forced. So there's several things that you could do. You could, execute the last 3rd steps with light and fast actions. So there's various things that you could do. It's not just one step will kill all. You just need to really think about what the problem that the athlete has got and what you can do to overcome that problem. So there's various things you can do. Various.
Yeah, I mean, I was chatting to John Shepherd about this, and if he's listening, good evening. He likes using the mats and putting different, mats at those stride lengths, which kind of teaches the concept of that lowering and feeling of those last two strides coming in, where for maintaining that speed, but looking at those lowering. I think the rhythm and the cues and the noise. I think someone's talking about. The difference in step sound, all these things it's communicating with the athlete to what works for them and what they feel. And I think it's important to, when you're teaching this concept, is getting feedback from them to say, what did you feel? What were you thinking? What did it sound like or feel like? And then using their language and how they conveyed back to you to do that.
Yeah. It could also be a strength problem. Yeah. So what you try to improve is the eccentric strength around the hips, knees, and feet, and that could be another problem that you may have to look at.
Yeah. So there's a question here. I've seen athletes take a lateral step in the penultimate. Any reason why? I think Carl Lewis actually done this. I'm not sure if this was kind of Carl Lewis, Mike Powell thing. Certainly Carl Lewis took a step to the side. Again, all you're doing is displacing the hips. So rather than stepping forward in that direction, athletes are stepping to the left or stepping to the right. For me, that's probably not so. It's a strategy. It's probably not the strategy to employ. They want to maintain the knee flexion, so they want to maintain that knee flexion. They don't want to close the knee flexion too much, but by going off to the side, they're lengthening that last stride. So again, it's just a way to lower the hips. That would be the reason why. But the disadvantage of that is you would lose the efficiency of the horizontal velocity on that.
Well, I understand that there two schools of thoughts here. So you've got the American style, which is what Carl Lewis uses, stepping to the side, and I understand that actually helps to maintain the velocity on the runway. I would always teach a traditional, which is what we do here. I'm not sure why the Americans choose to do it that way, but it seems to have given them a lot of results in the past. Having sat and watched through Bob Beamon several times, he doesn't actually do that, and actually does the traditional stuff which we do in Europe and within the UK and all around the world.
Cool. Right, I've got one more question and then we'll crack on, I think. Loving the penultimate step focus. From which level of lowering would you guys intervene in the penultimate execution to avoid it being too low? I think for me, first of all, would just be the resultant. What does that look like? It's too low. The athlete's just unable to get out of it. It's scrubbing the speed off too much. The sound too heavy on the board. These are all kind of things that I would see. You just wouldn't see that crisp, fresh kind of takeoff. For me, then I'd start intervening, and then start cueing and communicating that with the athlete, showing the video. This is what I'm seeing. This is where you are. We need to see you up here, and then allow them to process that. Frank, thoughts?
Yeah, I think exactly what I was going to say, Darren. Yeah.
Okay, right, cool. All right, well let's crack on. Conscious of time. So that's kind of looked at the purpose and the goals of the penultimate. Now let's have a look at the takeoff for this evening. So again, purpose of goals is to generate that vertical velocity. We've got the horizontal velocity down the runway. Now we want to generate that vertical lift. Again, the key thing is conservation of posture. We want to make sure we maintain that posture. And if we kind of quickly think back to Daria Kloshina, her posture was nice and upright. I think Samai, we'll see him jump shortly. His posture is almost leaning forward into the board, so his shoulders are in front of his hips. And that has a knock-on effect for what it does at takeoff in the air. But yeah, so we want to maintain that posture, and we want to maintain or not lose as much horizontal velocity as possible. Balance is really important. All of this is about coordination and making sure that when we finish that takeoff, it sets the athlete up for that mid-air action in whatever technique they do, whether it's the hitch kick, the hang, the sail, whatever. And again, an effective takeoff, there is a range, as we're looking at between 19 and 22. So we see the best athletes in the world operating within this area. Frank, anything to add to that? Fair?
Oh, no, that's it. Yeah.
Cool. So in terms of the takeoff, there's a number of mechanisms that are happening that we need to consider, and the reason we need to consider that is that has an implication on how we coach it, but also how we condition the athlete for the jump. So Lees and colleagues, and this is old research, and again the biomechanics really haven't changed since then, but it stated that there was evidence for two mechanical, a muscular, and a biomechanical mechanism that acts through that takeoff phase. Now the four mechanisms are described as the pivot. So if we look at that fixed position at takeoff coming through, in the same way as a wooden stick would pivot over, or similar to the pole vault, we've got that first part is the one mechanism. We've got the kind of swinging action of the free limbs, with the free leg and the arms. We've got the enhancement through that stretch shortening cycle. So we're loading up the quads, the Achilles, the calves to generate that stretch, and then we get the energy return from that using that stretch shortening cycle. And then at the end is that contraction, the concentric action as the muscle shorten through there. So we get that muscular element. So from a pivot point of view, we want to make sure that we don't get too much collapse in the knee and ankle and hip joints. So we need to be able to have an element of isometric strength conditioning with that to maintain that fixed position. Through the stretch shortening, there's going to be the lengthening of the muscles, and therefore we need to be able to condition the athletes eccentrically. So resist that load as the muscle extends, and that's what's happening through that stretch shortening cycle. And then of course concentric, as the muscle shortens, we need to do that. So activities, exercises that traditionally coach develop the muscle concentric action on that. So all those four mechanisms all contribute to the athlete generating vertical lift at takeoff, and we'll look at that just now. So some technical considerations for looking at, and we've got Miguel Echeverria here from his 883 jump that he jumped at. Now these images are really for illustrative, and there's a couple of things that I would like to suggest to him that might improve his takeoff if he needs it. However, preparation of takeoff legs. So we want to see that dorsiflexion of the ankle, and again we talked about, as I just mentioned, that isometrically we want to see the loading of the quads. And so the isometric action, it means that there is no flexion across the knee at that point. Okay, so we don't want to see the knee collapsing. And as we can see at maximum knee flexion on that second image in the top right, very little knee flexion from Miguel there at all, and low recovery of the takeoff step. And we can see that on there. But I'd see on the first image, where his heel is really quite high up behind his buttocks, I would actually want to see that shin angle being more parallel, but that heel lower. That will allow the free knee and the foot to travel through properly at the other end. We'll talk about that in a sec. Contact patterns again are active and flat, and we're going to see that roll in action. So you got heel flat and then there's a roll off. Again, similar to the penultimate, foot contact is slightly in front of the center of mass, although Echeverria has a huge pronounced extended takeoff normally. And again, we see the pivot of the shin, and we can see that in the third image, the bottom left one. As the heel comes off, we can see now the stretch of the back of the legs, the Achilles, the gastroc soleus, to give us a stretch reflex from there. And we see that elastic loading, and of course extension of the support leg, as we see in the fourth image there. So the swing-in segments, we've got the free leg coming through, that full motion loaded from the penultimate. So again, the speed of that free leg will be the stretch reflex of that free leg will help the speed through. And again, the speed of that is determined by the displacement of that penultimate step. And of course, the arms, we want to see them again in sync and in coordination with the legs, that powerful alternating drive, and then that block. That block is going to help lift the athlete to take off. And again, the path of the center of mass, again, as a result of that knee flexion, we are going to see a lowering and traveling into the board. But ultimately, we're going to see the rise of that hips passing as the hips pass over the board. Lots of stuff to go through there. We'll have a look at some videos shortly. Frank, any comments on that?
No, that's fine.
Cool. Okay. So in terms of the path of the center of mass, and for me, just illustrating that last point there at takeoff, we have two, we've got some kind of visual representations of this, again, pulled from 2017 World Championships. As you can see with Brittany Reese, at touchdown on the board, there's just after touchdown, there's a little bit of lowering. And I think referring back to the table was 1 centimetre. But we know that from Brittany's penultimate, she lowers excessively into the penultimate and starts to rise at takeoff. So that lowering is as a result of the little knee flexion that we see, and then we got the rise in the center of mass at toe off after the board. Where we compare that with Daria Klashina, we still see a shorter last stride coming in, but we see a greater degree of knee flexion. Well, we will shortly see a greater degree of knee flexion, and as a result, we see a greater lowering of the center of mass as she travels through the board. And again, there's another illustration there of Tiana there. So if we look at some of these figures on the table, the note at the bottom says a negative body inclination angle indicates that the center of mass is behind the foot of contact. So we can see that second column there, minus 39 degrees, minus 38, 35. All the center of mass is always behind that takeoff foot. A negative lead thigh angle means the thigh is below horizontal. And this is really interesting for me because we always see, we want to see that free leg and the thigh of that free leg drive through, and we want to block that to horizontal. But we can see here that none of the athletes are actually achieving that. They drive that knee just below horizontal. Frank?
Yeah, carry on, sorry.
And then on the other one, we've got a negative angular velocity. So on the right table, we see the knee angle at touchdown. So we've got 156 degrees there of a knee angle from Brittany and 137 degrees there for the minimum knee angle. So the minimum knee angle or maximum knee flexion is 137, and that's the maximum knee flexion angle as the hips pass over the board. So if we look at Daria Klashina, 172 to 144. So again, we see that lowering, that contributing to the lowering of center of mass. And if we look at the men, we talk about Manyonga having 5 centimeters lowering, Lawson and Samai, very similar. Again, we talk about the same figures there, body angle, and the thigh angle. Again, in the men, the thigh in terms of driving that through, none of them are really hitting that horizontal. I'm trying to look at, yeah, so we can see that there. Reinforce the point. Any questions on that, Frank? Happy with that?
Yep.
Okay, let's crack on. So let's have a look at some of these. Again, I've got the 3 protagonists in the competition. We'll look at it real time, a little bit slower and slower still. Nice upright position coming in. Again, great coordination. Great, it's great. It's awesome watching that.
Yeah, it's good. Good stuff.
So,
Hardly any sinking here.
yeah, very little sinking. We see more sinking from Manyonga at the takeoff. So we can see here at touch, so we've got that knee angle, which I think was about 170 degrees or there or thereabouts. And then the knee flexion was about 134, and as a result, we see that lowering. And then we start seeing that coming off. And that's for certainly the men and certainly Manyonga, you need a greater strength, greater isometric and eccentric strength qualities to be able to get out of that jump. That'd be fair, Frank?
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, let's have a look at Lawson. Again, it happened so quickly, so difficult to see. Again, so I mentioned this earlier, Lawson, his trunk, his actually shoulders are just in front of his hips. I think Samai do that as well. It's awesome, I could look at that all day.
I think he lowers a bit more than Manyonga does, just slightly.
So we can see there's that flat foot, and we can see the shin rolling over. The trunk is upright. Or if anything, it's more positive coming in. As he extends the hip, we get that displacement. So that free leg can catch it. So the foot's about to get touched down, and we've got that displacement in the free leg coming through, which will help with the speed of the free leg there. And he's pulling that. I think some people, it's not something we talked about, is that negative leg speed. So rather than just sticking the foot out and leaving it there, we need to be able to look at the glute and the hamstring and actually pulling that takeoff leg back and down. So the velocity of the takeoff leg is going back the way to minimize any deceleration at takeoff. And I think that's where people often foul is they just stick the leg out and leave it there, and they're traveling into the board and foul, rather than being more active and actually pulling that leg back and underneath. And then through, and it's loading up the, let's pass it too quick. So I can quickly jump. We're doing for time, nearly there. Again, we're loading up the quads and the Achilles, get that and that eccentric action, and then we get the kick out of that as a result of that stretch reflex coming off. And for me, it's a synchronization of all of these elements coming together and happening at the right time at the same time. That's where we get the big distances. I think the coordination and the timing of all that is really essential, really key. Frank, any comments on that?
No, it would have been good to have had an audio at takeoff and heard what happens at takeoff, and you would probably would have heard the 3 bam 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 on takeoff. But
well, you can dub that over if I play it over.
yeah.
All right, we'll go one more, and then let's have a look at just to kind of again just think about the points that we've covered, and then see if you can see what we've been talking about.
There, good.
And again, his posture is slightly positive, and what's happening, he's generating huge amount of forward rotation at takeoff. And we'll cover this in the next presentation, but he's really fighting hard and really trying to slow down that rotation. But that's for another day. But awesome. Okay, is there anything you want to pick out on there, Frank?
No, so I think someone had a question. What is the key point for a short height athlete? So we just watched one. That's the key point. I don't actually know what the question.
So there's some. So I've got some questions. What is the key point for a short height athlete to achieve this? for short athletes. Yeah, I mean, just get phenomenally fast and phenomenally strong and springy. I think the proportions that we talk about will change. So if you're a female, working with an athlete who's 150 centimeters tall, then you need to look at these proportions differently. And again, is looking at their ability to generate horizontal vertical lift.
So Dwight Phillips was a good example. Very, very quick over 60 meters, very, very quick over 50, but definitely wasn't the tallest long jumper around at the time.
He was the same height as me. Thought he was quite tall.
Well, it was a bit heavy.
Okay, and Noel Butler has kind of posed the question: is he maximising the extension on the knee coming through, or is he dropping it quite early? I think that's probably the, Noel, is that in the penultimate or in the takeoff? If you could maybe clarify, that was in Lawson. Let's quickly go through that. In the takeoff, yeah, I mean, it's the thing is that the free leg, I would say that he could probably hold that little bit longer to give him that impetus. Because we can see here, as you've said, Noah is driven. Has he finished the work done?
No,
Probably not.
That free leg could be driven a lot higher than that.
Yeah. I mean, I think he still jumps 843.
Yeah.
So it's solid. I would take it. But I often think about what's happening before. So on that, the free leg. Let's see.
She keep going.
I've gone. What I was going to say is the position of the foot. So right here you see his heel on the right leg is by his buttocks. I would want to see that heel down and that shin parallel. So what's happening is that foot has to go, because it's coming from a height, it has to go low. So it's kicking the leg out. So for me, I would want to see the heel lower, and then frees up the space to drive and keep that foot high and keep the knee in position. Because at the moment,
what you're saying is the foot is too far back, and really
the foot is too far behind his glute, and it needs to be sitting lower. And so the shin angle there, rather than being tight, it needs to be almost at 90 degrees behind the knee. So that shin's almost parallel to the ground. That will allow him to then free, because what happens is, as a result of what's happened before, his foot is high and has to come low. So when he comes out, it's coming from a high position, it kicks through, and then it just kicks out. We just can't stop it at the right time. So yeah, so it kicks out like that because it's come from a high position. It's kicking out low. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Right, let's crack on, because I'm conscious we've still got a few more slides to do. Hope you guys are still with us. Okay. So training modalities. So before we actually get into some exercises, I think it's important that for a coach to establish your coaching system, your teaching system, your pedagogical approach to developing these drills and skills, the coordination of that. And I think it's important to set that up, making sure that you can observe, internalize that and compare that against that model, the technical model, and then be able to give that feedback. So your observation skills are really key as well. So that's what we're talking about with that teaching system. Drills and teaching, and again, there's a lot of discussion and debate about this. Drills doesn't necessarily mean to say you're going to develop that technique with the drills. I think for me, the drills are very much about conceptual teaching, teaching positions, teaching shapes. I think that's really key, rather than thinking if you're going to do loads of drills, that's going to transition into doing the right technique. I think it's about, again, understanding the concept of those, what you're trying to achieve with the athlete on that. And that has to be done in situ, in whatever environment or context that you employ that in. In terms of parts of the system, we're going to show a series of exercises that are fundamental exercises from skipping right through. But again, we can look at teaching progressions and how we can make it more complex or making it easier. Again, that's just to challenge the athlete, but progress it as well. And again, the exercises need to be related to the event. And it's important that we can do it in part. We can look at shaping and chaining and look at whole part whole and bringing it all together. That's the key point, is that when we're teaching the approach, the penultimate, the takeoff, it's important that we can take that apart and focus on that in isolation. But I think it's important that we bring all those sequences together and we exercise and train those parts. Anything you want to add on that?
No,
Frank, in terms of your teaching?
no. I mean, rhythm becomes part of it as well, but I'm sure you're going to capture that on the
Yeah,
next.
no, absolutely. And rhythm is something that I suppose it can only be done at speed. You know, you can't teach someone the rhythm if you're coming in at, 2 steps, 4 steps. It's difficult to do. So fundamental exercises. So again, we're looking at skipping for height, skipping for distance, running jumps. So for me, I'm just going to, rather than go through each of those, we'll show the video. And the one that I don't have in the video is the mat drills, and it's something that I mentioned earlier around the penultimate. And again, it's something that you can play around with on that. John Shepherd, do a search for him. He'll have some videos and stuff on that to help you with that area as well. So let's quickly go to that final one. So again, just normal skipping. And this is alternate leg, so it doesn't really matter which takeoff leg. And I think it's important when that's one leg. We'll just run it through, and then we can kind of revisit it again and pause. And hopefully you can start to see the progressions of the takeoff drills and how they become more complex and the intensity. So this is 1 step drill now. So 1 step, and then we bring the arms in. So again, we're adding a little bit more complexity with the coordination. And then we're adding obstacles now. We're looking at that kind of task constraints and changing the environment to get the desired outcome. And last is, I think it's important just when we're watching that video there, is that when we're landing, we want to teach a safe landing position. So this kind of demonstration, the athlete landed in a single leg. I think it's important just for safety that we land in 2 foot or completely full jump. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
And I like to see with those drills that he did, I like to see a bit more dorsiflex on the lead. Yeah.
So let me quickly just go through, demonstrate them. So this is just skipping. And again, it's important that we do both legs, not just developing one leg. Although if you're a left leg or a right leg takeoff, I think it's important to develop both sides, or you're going to get one side stronger than the other. Here we're looking at skipping, but just looking at the takeoff leg, just one leg, and you do it both sides. And again, what we do now is, rather than saying, giving the athlete lots of different cues, and I want you to think about driving the knee up, and I want you to get extension off the ground, all you do is we set up a series of hurdles, an appropriate spacing, and just say, right, drive the foot over the hurdle, and then let them solve that puzzle. So what we're doing now is giving them movement puzzles to solve within that training. And we're seeing that desired outcome. Does that give us the outcome that we're looking for? Yes or no? If it doesn't, I want to see greater lift, I want to see more height. I could say to the athlete, give me more height, give me more lift, or I can change the environment and I can look at throwing in some hurdles that are higher and see how he negotiates them.
So if you can just pause it for a little bit, just as he goes over the hurdle. Yeah, keep going. Right, you see that lead leg?
Yeah.
I like to see the foot kicked out a little bit more, so the foot is directly underneath the knee.
The knee.
Yeah. And at the moment it isn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, good point. So now so what we've done now is we've increased the distance. So we've kept the height the same, but now we've increased the distance and say, right, have a shot at that. And again, we're probably still seeing what you don't like, that foot tucked in too much.
Yeah.
Again, now we're looking at, rather than skipping, we're looking at a one stride takeoff. And this athlete's a hitch kick, so we're looking at those initial arm exchanges at takeoff. What we're going to do now is, again, it's a one stride takeoff. So rather than having the free leg going over the side of the hurdle, and now asking the athlete to go directly over the hurdle. And I think, Frank, for me, I think once we've done that, we start to see that's a really nice position.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the knee is probably a bit higher than what we would want to see in the takeoff as a result of some of the stuff that we saw before. But I think great range, great position. We've got that foot dorsiflex and that foot sitting just underneath the knee.
Yeah. So as they get better, obviously the height of the hurdle is going to go up. So they do go a lot higher than what we see at the moment. Yeah,
absolutely. But I think it's important to know that as we increase the height of the hurdles, we need to make sure you still see the desired outcome that you're looking for. Yeah. And if you start seeing them collapsing and folding to try and negotiate that, and the shape doesn't look right, then it's too high. That'd be fair? Yep.
Yep.
And then we're going into 3, 1, 2, 3, take off. 1, 2, 3, take off. And again, with these, we can start introducing. With all of these, really, we could then finish off that rep into the sandpit, and you can change your positions, and athletes can start playing with steering a little bit if they want, and making sure that they make those adjustments before coming into the pit. Okay, I've got probably a minute to cover 4 more slides. Okay. So guys, hope you're with us. Still there, great, thank you. The takeoff coaching points. So a number of points from me, really, just to summarize. Encourage jumpers to think about jumping first and then running up and out of the ground. I think often we see athletes running through to the board and not actually preparing and doing that, loading up and taking off. So I think it's important that we do that. Focusing only on running into the board tends to cause the jumpers not to load that takeoff leg. So I think it's important to do that and ensure that they don't bypass that vertical lift. I think it's important in terms of posture and position. If the head wise, if you're looking down, that has a big impact on posture, position, and balance. So it's important that athletes should keep their eyes up and out when leaving the ground, and that helps with the projection. I always think about lifting that chest up and projecting that chest up. And as we've seen with Lawson, and as Noel had pointed out, is the knee drive just dropped too early. So I think that knee drive to help lift the athlete up and make them lighter at takeoff is crucial, and we shouldn't really rush that process either. And again, in terms of teaching the takeoff, we can look at short approach, working on those last 2 strides coming into the board. That allows us, to spend more time. We can isolate areas, we can emphasize areas. But as it's short approach, we can get more repetition in. More repetition means we've got a better chance of getting it right, more practice without too much fatigue. I think certainly this time of year, as we start winter training, I think it's really important. We can do lots of great work off short approach, but as we progress through the season, over the next 6-8 weeks, we can move out to a medium length approach, and then longer approach as we get towards competition season. But I think it's important that we work on technical work week 1 of winter training and no short approach stuff. Again, that's a philosophical approach. Not everyone, but yeah. Anyways, takeoff foot must be flat and active. I think, and Frank, I think it's your kind of critical point really in your coaching and your philosophy is they need to get the foot right at takeoff. If they don't get the foot right, then everything else is knocked on from that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, consider that rhythm, that da-da rhythm as the hips moves through that process, through the penultimate and the takeoff. Okay, so just to finish off, we talked about the technical elements, and when we think back to the mechanisms of the takeoff, the four mechanisms, the pivot, the swing, the eccentric loading of the shortening cycle, and the concentric element, we need to make sure that not just the horizontal velocity, but there's huge amount of strength and technical considerations in this area. But eccentric capacity is fundamental in that takeoff. If we don't have that strong isometric and eccentric capacity in the athletes, and it's not a component in our conditioning, athletes are going to be missing out on that at takeoff. So this is the force velocity continuum that I've kind of introduced in the last presentation, with a couple of kind of modifications. One at the top, again with takeoff, it's single leg. You don't take off with 2 feet. So I think it's important that we get some single leg component work in there. Single leg squat, concentric and eccentric, whether it's eccentric and lowering and just controlling the lowering, or true eccentric work where the load is above the capacity at which you can hold that, but that's very much for developing athletes and senior athletes. And again, just as you progress through that continuum, the speed of the load and the speed of the movement gets quicker, and it's important from the plyometrics, looking at the reactive ground contact time is less than 200 milliseconds. We can take off drills with resistance, a weighted jacket on, with maybe 2% or 5% body weight. I don't know if that's something that you use, Frank, in terms of that specific strength, where I get the athletes maybe put a few pounds on the jacket, do some jumps, and then take off.
Carrying a dumbbell to do a few exercises with, yeah, that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And then some assisted takeoffs, and I'm going from a box, so some people do an elevated takeoff, so the path of the hips is traveling up, so essentially it's a lighter takeoff, and that again, the other element of the takeoff from the box is it allows the athlete to spend more time in the air and work on technique. But again, we can work on that in the next session. And I think that's it. Questions? The last few slides were a bit quick, so my apologies on that. We'll go into questions from Darren Morrison. Let's have a look at that. So with the knee drive at takeoff, are we looking for the knee to be as high as possible, or is it a decent range to prevent it dropping early, excluding the shinning we mentioned before? Listen, I think that we don't want to see the knee going above hip height. Absolutely not. But as we've shown with some of the biomech data, that very few of the athletes are actually getting that thigh horizontal. I think it's the intention of driving the speed and the velocity of that free leg up to that point. I think that's the key point, is the angular velocity of that free leg coming up that helps the athlete lift. Frank, you want to kind of...
No, carry on. That was good.
Okay, cool. I don't know if we've answered. Is it maximum extension? Yeah, we've covered that one already. Is side lowering in the penultimate?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a bad thing. I mean, Carl Lewis used it a lot and was able to jump far, and that's what they seem to teach in American schools and colleges. Sidestepping, I don't know. Some people use it as a cue to slow down. Some athletes do, which is not what you want to do, but it seems to work for the Americans.
I think the problem with the side step as well is that if you step to the side, then that has an effect on the projection when you're in the air.
Mm-hmm.
So the takeoff resultant, so people kind of drift more to the left or to the right, and that can often be as a result of that sidestepping, as what they've done before. But again, it would be on a case-by-case basis on that one. Okay, I'm going to be coaching juniors. What is the best route to start them off in runway speed, or concentrating on the last 3 steps and speed at the end? Frank, I'll let you crack on with that one.
Loads of stuff you could do, ins and outs, pickups, I call them. So you work on 30 meters or 20 meters fast, 20 meters relaxed, 20 meters fast. Or what you could do is build ups, loads of build ups, and working those last 3-4 strides. So if you ever think of using a hoover to suck a paper, as soon as you get that hoover close to that paper, it sucks it in. And that's how the athlete wants to feel. When he gets closer to that board, he feels like, or they feel like they're being sucked in by that board. And it's just the thought of thinking of, this is what I want to do, rather than letting it happen. They've actually got to feel it and they've got to want it. So my thoughts when I'm doing it with my athletes is feel like you're being sucked in by that board. Yeah. So there's loads of imaginative stuff that you can do.
So my question is my answer to that is both. I think it's important I don't think you can, do one exclusively and then do the other one. I think you can do it parallel in the program. I think you just look at making sure that you plan it and plan enough time in there. For me, it's about the kind of principle of reversibility. You use it or lose it. So if you're not developing speed in your program, your athletes are not getting quick. And it's the same with the takeoff, the coordination and that. I think it's important that, you're working on both. You just need to look at time in your program and how you plan that in.
So I had an athlete that used to back off 4 strides before the board. And what I would say to the athlete is to lean in a bit more. So you've got to have a look at the position the athlete is in. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a couple more questions and then that might be us for this evening. I was wondering what you think about using over velocity at the last steps, a pull with a long rubber string or vertical pulling aids in the penultimate takeoff like Nelio. I think when Nelio was over in England last year, he demonstrated some of that. Would that be right, Frank?
I didn't go to the presentation, but I believe he did. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for me it's about the neuro coordination, neuromuscular coordination, and that adaptation that you're looking to get from that. I think Mihambo, she has a fulcrum. She has a system that she's strapped into, and she can do her sprints at a lighter weight and take off. So she's on a pulley, or just her weight is just supported, and that allows her to get a faster ground contact time, faster takeoff, and that's what she's trying to elicit in the competition. Faster ground contact times, lighter takeoff. So I think that would be the kind of training adaptation that we would try to get. For me, that's probably the 1%. I think if you're looking at jumping 850 and you want to jump 860, 870, I think I would probably start looking at things like that. But if you're working with a 5 meter developing, athlete, I wouldn't be looking at. It's probably not something I would look at. Would that be fair,
Yeah,
Frank?
that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's that. We've got a request here. It's possible to send a video email for some technical feedback. Sure, a fee. Frank, we could probably do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, seriously, no. Fire it through. Happy to help. And I think that's it. Unless anyone has any other questions, we've still got a few more people on. I'm fine for time. If anyone has any further questions, else we will wrap it up. I appreciate we've gone through quite a lot in a relatively short period of time. I was speaking to Frank earlier about this. I think we could have probably easily spent 3-4 hours on this.
Yeah.
Maybe get into the nitty-gritty of it. But however, maybe another time. But great, Frank. Well, it's been great having you again with you tonight.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for leading, and thank you for attending, guys. Thank you very much, and hope to see you on the next one.
Yeah, we'll be back. Oh, good question, actually. Brilliant point. Next steps. We are back again. We are back again next month. We're looking at the final phase in this series where we're looking at the flight and the landing. So we've looked at the takeoff. It's right. What's happening next? We'll look at the different techniques and look at the landing piece. In a couple of weeks' time, I think it's going to be Aston and Frank looking at the hop takeoff, And that's going to take us, that series of triple jumps going to take us right through into Christmas and into the new year. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll be here anyways. Again, if anyone is looking for further discussions around coaching, we have our regional coach leads are running sessions on the 28th of September. You can sign on to them or through Athletics Hub, or you can contact the regional coach leads directly. The emails are there and they'll be able to sign you up. Somebody was asking for Frank's email. Frank, if you don't mind, I've added your email on the end there.
Yeah.
So guys, frank.atto@btinternet.com. All right, that's us. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, until next time, I'll see you all. Be safe out there, and see you in a few weeks, couple of weeks.
Thanks. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Frank.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.